Okay? And we're going to talk about science and how it can be helping you and how it may be hurting us right now. There's a little picture of my farm right there. A couple of weeks ago, I spoke to the National Beekeeping Conference in Schaumburg, Illinois, right outside of Chicago. And I asked them when did the bees start dying, right? Because we've been suffering massive losses of our pollinators around the country. 2008, they said, 2008. I said, great, okay. How many millions of dollars have we spent on this problem? And they said, oh, hundreds of millions of dollars. I'm like, all right, so we've had, 12 years, hundreds of millions of dollars. How many of your bees died last year? The room got real quiet because it was the same as in 2008, right? This isn't a bee problem, but we treated it as though it was, okay? The bees are the canary in the coal mine. This is not a bee problem. This is the worst mass extinction event that the planet has ever experienced. And it's being caused by us, all right? We're losing wetlands. We're draining those, get those out of there. It's hard to farm wetlands, right? Grasslands, where'd the prairie go? Entire insect communities, many of you have heard of the insect apocalypse. This is very real, all right? We've lost 70% of insect biomass in the last 27 years. 70%, all right? We're losing birds, we're losing bats, we're losing bees, we're losing butterflies, okay? This is not just a bee problem. What's the problem here? There it is. It's not soybeans. It's how we're growing our soybeans. Agriculture has become much, much too simplified. Much too simplified. When you grow a single crop on a piece of ground, when you are extracting one revenue stream off of a piece of ground, that is a monoculture. Nature abhors these things. When you eliminate the biodiversity from your farm, you eliminate all of the things that biodiversity used to do. All right? Biodiversity is life. Biodiversity is microbes, fungi, insects, plants, birds, all of those things. And when you eliminate all of those things, all of those ecosystem services, what do? You have to replace it in order to keep that land productive. So you go out and you buy a jug, right? You buy a jug and you put it out there. And the more jugs you buy, the more jugs you need, all right? By their definition, agrochemicals are an addiction. The more you use, the more you need. And I don't give a crap whether it says organic on the side of the jug or whether it says, magical elixir or something like this, or whether it says, Bravo or some other, militant name that you use from the other side of agriculture. These things have problems. These things have problems. Seed treatments, neonicotinoids. You heard of these? Neonics? Most of the seeds that they're currently planted on about 13% of the terrestrial land surface of our country. One seed has enough insecticide, one corn seed has enough insecticide to kill 164,000 bees. One corn seed, okay? That's the kind of scale that we're talking about here. And they're not staying put. You see, we have to use these. We have to use these types of things in order to maintain this system, right? You have to, you've eliminated all the life, so you got to keep that thing productive. So you have to buy this stuff, right? Neonicotinoids, I had a call from one of my colleagues out in Montana. They were saying, you know what, the white-tailed deer, weird things are going on. 70% of them had this jaw deformity. 70% of the males had genital deformities. We want to know whether or not neonics are contributing to this. And so we ran a study. This was a very difficult study. Elise did this, one of my master's students, together with a colleague at South Dakota State, wildlife biologist. We ran a captive bred deer study. This is a very difficult study to run. We administered neonicotinoids to these white-tailed deer over a 2-year period and studied their fawns as well as these deer. The dead fawns had significantly higher levels of imidacloprid in their spleens. The spleens was the magical organ in this case. Nobody knew this prior to this experiment, that spleens were the things we should be looking at. More imidacloprid in the spleens of these animals was associated with reduced fawn body weight, fawn organ weights, fawn thyroid hormone levels. This is important. Hormones have so many effects that we do not get. If we're screwing up hormones, well, we're seeing that in the bees as well, aren't we? Fawn jawbone lengths were offset by neonic levels. And activity levels in adult deer were significantly slower in animals that had higher levels in their spleen. What's a slow deer in the wild? It's a dead deer, right? So we said, okay, well, that's what you were able to do in the lab, right? That's what you were able to do under these captive conditions. What happens in the field, because we live in the real world, right? So this is how much we found this is what we were able to generate in our captive deer. We found 3 times as much in the spleens from North Dakota wild deer. So currently we're looking at 700 spleens from Minnesota deer. Wake up, right? Wake up. This stuff, organic doesn't mean organic anymore. We found organics had just as much neonics as conventional crops do, or the cover crop, or the conservation strips that we were trying to feed our bees. Organics are just as contaminated as conventional, okay? Our current approach isn't working. Our current approach to science isn't working. Our current approach to food production isn't working. Our current approach to beekeeping isn't working. We need change. Yes, we can grow 14-foot tall corn. Look at the soil. It's hard to know where the bed sheet stops and the soil begins, right? We're roasting it. This is corn grown on chemotherapy. We can do it, but for how long? This is where I live, right here. Yellow is corn, green is soybeans. A university president gave me a call, or rather an email. Said, John, he was pissed. He's like, well, John, what you were saying about science is discrediting us. I mean, it's making the land-grant universities have a mission, right? I mean, for those of you who don't know the story, in the 1860s, President Lincoln gave each state land. That land was essentially, and money, to do no strings attached research, to drive our food production system, to innovate it. That's where the land-grant universities came from. It was a brilliant idea because he knew that if you let corporate America get into this research, that it was going to corrupt it. Okay? So this university president says, John, what you've done, you've discredited us. We contribute to conservation agriculture. We research this stuff. And I said, look at the relative investment here. All right? Where is the money from these universities going in reality? And when a university president can drive through Iowa and say, you know what, or through the almond orchards, Central Valley of California, what the hell? Let's call it out. And they can say, what we've done here, this was on my watch. And what we've done is morally and ethically wrong. That is when the land grant mission of the universities will be realized again. But it ain't coming from there. Until that happens, it's got to be punchy little organizations like Ecdysis that fills the role that the universities used to fill. Scientists are right now, agricultural science is messed up. It's messed up, okay? We're project focused, we're not problem focused. We're solving we're getting that 3-bushel yield bump. We're trying to, a lot of the science, most of the science is driven into incrementally improving a damaged or broken system rather than questioning whether that system was correct to begin with. We're slapping down symptoms. We're not solving problems, okay? It's whack-a-mole farming, right? You whack one thing down and 2 more problems pop up over here. Oh, good, well, it's fun to watch. Research, unfortunately, is for sale to the highest bidder. The money that was given to the universities is now eaten up by bureaucracy, okay? And so scientists within that system are forced to chase funds wherever they can get them. Because you don't get your job, you don't get promoted unless you're bringing home the bacon. All right? As such, the larger an institution gets, the larger the pots of money are needed in order to keep those institutions going. Where are the largest pots of money? Right? Yeah. The big corporations. And there's naming rights on every one of them, on these buildings and everything else that's going on. It's crazy. As such, research directions are controlled by where the money is coming from. Follow the money. Follow it. A big reason the regenerative agriculture isn't mainstream is because the scientists just don't understand it. Right? And then finally, too many of the scientists that are out there have completely lost their sense of mission. How have we evaluated ourselves as scientists, right? How do you know whether you're a good scientist? It's how many scientific papers you wrote. Okay, publish or perish, ever heard that? How many grant dollars you've acquired? How many grant dollars have you scored, right? And brought home, because 50%, 30 to 50% of the grant dollars goes into the university. That doesn't actually get used for research, right? That's called indirect. How many graduate students have you trained? What's your puppy mill looking like? They're not thinking about where these young scientists are going to get jobs. They're not thinking about treating students as apprentices and training them in the ways of science. They're technicians. How many committees have you served on lately? How many of that? How many of these metrics? Because all of these are exactly how you're evaluated. If you're a good scientist, that's what you have. How many of these things do farmers care about? Right? The only way that you advance within a system of science today is by adhering to these rules. Therefore, agricultural science is in a self-perpetuating rut we can't get out of. We can't. How do we get out of it? You get out of the matrix, right? You run out of the matrix. That's how you get out. First off, the scientists have to actually start practicing farming. How on earth can you understand how to solve farming problems, beekeeping problems, if you've never walked a mile in your shoes? Right? Scientists need to reevaluate how they are being successful. Research needs to have a totally different funding model. We've got to extract ourselves from the strings that are holding us down. And then finally, we need to be training scientists in how to communicate science to the farmers, the people who need it the most. All right? There is change. There is hope. The farmers are leading this, right? The farmers are leading this charge all over the world right now. They're practicing what's called regenerative agriculture. They're changing the focus of their farms. And they're doing things in spite of science. All right? Also, change is happening within science. This is Blue Dasher Farm. This is our model of how agricultural science ought to be happening. All right? We're located right there in eastern South Dakota. Blue Dasher Farm is the first in what we're calling a national network of hubs in science in regenerative ag. We're bringing the science around the country. We're opening up a new facility, hopefully here in the next year, year and a half, here in California, as well as in Colorado. What have we done so far? We broke out of the system. I worked for USDA for 11 years. And in 2016, I quit, and we started this place, all right? I tried to change the system from within, and that doesn't work. I tried to change the government from within. That didn't work. I had to get out. We've written a lot of peer-reviewed papers, publish or perish. We have to keep that metric going, at least to maintain some scientific credibility. What's important is that I don't give a crap where the paper is published. I'm not writing my paper for other scientists. I'm writing my papers for you. So out of our papers, 20% of those papers have been in the top 5% of all science ever written in terms of social media impact. 4 of them in the top 1%, right? Not bad. We've worked face-to-face contacts with farmers from around the world, 21,000 farmers so far in our 4 years since opening up. That's where change is going to happen. That's where scientists stop getting out of it, or they get out of their ivory tower and become people, right? That's the relationships that foster change. We've hosted hundreds at our field events. Boots on the ground. We've grown to 17 staff in 8 states and 2 provinces up in Canada. It's just been amazing what's been going on. Dozens of films, newspapers, lots of things. And then we're expanding out. Here is one example of the kinds of research that we have had to ask, or that we are asking now, or pursuing now, rather than what we were doing when I was working at the USDA. California ag, everybody recognizes this, right? It's characterized by, yes, heavy tillage. If you till your soil, that is an awful thing to do. I would rather spray an herbicide than till the soil. Heavy agrochemical use and very little plant diversity in cropland, okay? This is work, is there a better way, is the question that we wanted to ask. This is work that's been done by Tommy Fenster. He's back there. Raise your hand, Tommy. And there's his poster is back. Oh, it was back there. What happened to your poster, Tom? Okay. Okay, good. Anyways, all of this research that we're presenting here will be on a poster that you can look at more specifically at the end. What we said when we started down this road, we started saying, you know what, soil health is the answer to a lot of these agricultural problems. The almond industry said, yeah, soil health won't work here. And so we said, okay, we're going to try it. We're going to give this a shot. We're going to find farmers who are applying soil health principles, regenerative principles on their land and do a side-by-side comparison of regenerative almond production in California versus conventional production in California. All right, let's see what we found. So the regenerative systems were using practices like no pesticides, they had eliminated that, perennial ground covers, compost teas, and then they were also integrating livestock in some of these orchards. The conventional guys were unified by the fact that they had bare soil, applied multiple pesticide applications annually. This is not Photoshop. This is a photo that Tommy took of 2 of these types of orchards side by side. You see the difference, right? Much different habitats. Organic matter was increased by 30% on the regenerative, right across the road. 30% more organic matter. Bulk density was reduced. That's a good thing. You want more light, airy soils. This one will change everything. 8 times the water infiltration. Just across the road, right? Think all water is going to be a limiting factor in California agriculture at any time? You think maybe? Invertebrate biomass, this is life, right? 6 times higher than the regenerative fields and the regenerative orchards. Pests were exactly the same. One of our orchardists, who's in the audience, I won't mention names, she can talk about it later, or those guys can talk about it. We had the conventional guy come over and showed him this data. And at the table, and he's like, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I sprayed 5 times last year. I sprayed insecticides 5 times. And what you're telling me is that the guy right across the road who didn't spray at all had the exact same number of pests. I followed the rules, right? These folks are following the rules. They're doing what they're being told to do. But it's wrong. The regenerative almond orchards were twice as profitable. It's not an ideological decision. This is a good business decision. All right? This should change the almond industry. Almonds are a profit-motivated crop. This should change the almond industry. If it doesn't, yeah, we got some really big, I got to think about this more. The regenerative system, so yes, in some there. We're looking at food safety, foodborne pathogens, nutritional quality of the almonds as a result of this. We're also replicating these types of studies in key commodities, key crops, key food systems around the country, trying to use these key systems as drivers of change in entire agricultural communities. We have to first validate these systems that, no, these are not just anecdotes, right? These are not just success stories of individual farmers, but we can take what these farmers are doing and learn from them and scale them and transfer them so that everybody can apply these and we can save our asses. Why isn't regenerative farming mainstream? Well, what we're talking about here is a paradigm shift, right? Paradigm shifts take time. Paradigm shifts require, yeah, they produce a lot of martyrs, right? It's not easy being the first person in the pool. This is me, a dapper young fellow. Look at that good-looking guy, right? I was with, was there a whistle? Did I hear a whistle? All right. Anyways, I was playing the game right. You know, I was with the USDA. Everything was going great. I was playing by the rules. I had tons of students and postdocs. It was wonderful. I published more than 130 peer-reviewed papers. I wrote my first book by the I had millions in grants. I was advising the EPA and risk assessment of genetically modified crops. I met the president in the White House. I was named one of the top young scientists in the country, right? Things were going great. And then I met these jerks. And they said, the pesticides are killing our bees. I said, no, they're not. The data isn't conclusive. The data is gray. It's not black and white. We need to do the work. And they said, no, you come on out and you watch my bees die when they're planting corn. And then you tell me that it's not the pesticides. And that's different, isn't it? That becomes less of a scientific question and more of a personal experience, but extremely moving and meaningful. And we did the work. And I'll be damned if the beekeepers weren't right. The pesticides are killing their bees, right? Not everybody's willing to hear that. I think we all need to ask ourselves why we're here, right? Because everything changed after I asked those questions with the USDA. Suddenly I started getting harassed. Suddenly everything, all of my paperwork seemed to be just wrong enough. Suddenly I started getting suspended for weird things. Suddenly everything started to fall apart. They started to suppress my science. And that wasn't right. I think we all have to ask ourselves why we're doing what we're doing. Was it the number of papers I was after, right? I'm doing a good job. I've got tons of papers. I just scored a huge $500,000 grant. Everybody up and down my command chain is patting me on the back. That's why I'm here, right? It wasn't why I was here. And I had to decide that for myself. And so I blew the whistle. It's not okay to suppress science, especially science that's in the interest of the people. Why are you here? Right? Is it bushels per acre? Is that why you guys are here right now? Is it pounds of beef per acre? Or is it something more? I believe that this planet is facing some serious problems right now. That the status quo isn't good enough. It's not good enough in science. It's not good enough in food production. And it's going to take bold action. We don't need more pamphleteers patting themselves on the back and giving out you a packet of wildflower seeds, for Christ's sake. That's not solving the problem. We need bold action. We need people who have the balls to stand up and actually make change to their own lives, but also to their communities, and to step out of the shadows. I would urge you to become an instrument of that change. We would not be here without an amazing group of young people that are just changing the world. Alex and Tommy are here right now, two of the graduate students were part of the program. We bankrolled our entire research facility on a crowdfunding campaign, an Indiegogo campaign. Beekeepers, ranchers, farmers around the world donated to make this a possibility. Ecdysis is a geeky entomology term for shedding the old skin, metamorphosis. It's our nonprofit. Blue Dasher Farm is Blue Dasher is a cool dragonfly, very important ecosystem indicator species. If you like what you hear, please consider supporting this science. It doesn't get funded any other way. And there's our Facebook, there's our Twitter. So thank you very much, everybody.
Oh, you're coming. Okay, thanks. Yay. You're in my blind spot.
No problem. I want to jump the gun. Matter with share.
Whichever one you want. Okay, thank you, Jonathan. That was fantastic. Thank you. So we have about 20 minutes or so for a little discussion. And, I wanted to pull out some themes that I heard and ask Jonathan and Leah to reflect on some of those some of the parts of the presentation and parts of the questions that come to mind. First one that really hit me was that you both were really talking about structural violence. You're both talking about systemic violence that's endemic to our society, whether it's the stealing of African American land, the stealing of labor, the colonization process that affected indigenous folks, or the destruction of bees, for example. Those are, both the people and to the ecology. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about how you feel about, if that feels accurate to you and what we can do about that kind of structural violence.
I think, violence is certainly there, but greed, I think, is another big component of that violence, and understanding in that and how do you combat it is a very challenging process right now, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I resonate with what you said about greed. I think that the food system fundamentally isn't broken, right? It's working as it was designed. And the DNA, so to speak, of the food system is the stolen land and exploited labor, and in turn, the exploitation of the earth. And that is because the goal of the food system is to concentrate wealth and power. It's not to heal the earth or provide us with sustenance or nourishment. And so it's not going to be incremental tweaks. It's going to be fundamentally reorienting the mission statement of the food system.
Great. So along those lines of greed and power and money, Jonathan, you kind of alluded to the role of corporations in subverting agricultural extension, for example, agricultural research. One of the things that I've been grappling with in coming to this job is really thinking about how do we make such bold change and how do we make bold action, as you suggested, in the face of a climate crisis and things that need to happen immediately. And, for a long time, my own thinking was around, well, we're nibbling around the edges and we're not going to make that bold change. We're just trying to keep people's livelihoods and keep the movement going. But now, now in 2020, it's clear we don't have that much time to be nibbling around the edges. So I'm wondering about what do you see the role of corporations in that bold action? Are they anathema? Are they the problem? Or is there kind of a conscious capitalism that we can work with to drive change?
Well, I think that they can be a part of the solution if they choose to be. I think, this becomes a very difficult problem in that I think that the solution to many of these issues is knowing who your farmer is or where your food is coming from. It's not labels. It's not these other elements. I think that connection is really important to where that food is coming from. These large corporations our distribution system of food and how it gets into large urban centers. I think you could probably really talk about that even deeper. But I think that if they believe in what they're doing and if they're serious about it and not just greenwashing, then I think that they can be a part of a solution. But where that comes in and what that looks like, we're in for some major evolution, that's for sure.
I think we have to differentiate between capitalism and corporations, right? Like a corporation is a legal entity that can be used to create a co-op, for example. But capitalism fundamentally is about consolidating profit and returns for shareholders. And I think that is fundamentally the wrong aim. You look at capitalist corporations to their extreme. Short story, in the Farm Bill, one of the many obscure provisions is called tied aid, which essentially means that any foreign aid that's given has to be grown by U.S. farmers, shipped on U.S. ships, U.S. ports, so forth, which sounds kind of innocuous. But then you look at what happened in the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, when Monsanto, in all of its benevolence, agreed to donate barge loads of rice seed to Haitian farmers right at the moment when the rice harvest was coming in, effectively undercutting the entire industry and aiming to displace native, what we call Creole seed, with this hybridized seed that relies on Monsanto chemicals. By the way, they'll give you the chemicals free for one season. And then after that, you're dependent on the corporation. The peasant farmers in Haiti met those barges at Port-au-Prince and burned the shipment, right? And I think we really need to be that bold and really call bullshit on what these large corporations are doing to our food system.
Thank you. So, one of the other things that struck me as well was in your talks was this kind of tension between doing your own thing and doing public policy advocacy. I thought it was really interesting, Jonathan, that you said that organic doesn't mean organic anymore. that organic crops are just as contaminated as conventional crops. So what does that mean for all of our efforts who are trying to, build organic slowly, farm by farm, doing our own thing? Is that a viable approach anymore, or do we really need to? I don't want to say, well, obviously we're not going to drop that, but what does that mean in terms of our own activities that we can do around policy advocacy to change the entire system and ban pesticides and change the incentives for conventional farming? What's the interplay between those two those two approaches?
Well, we have to start somewhere, and so yes, I think that going this route, developing successful organic and regenerative systems is essential in this solution. Governments lead, they don't, or the governments follow, they don't lead, and so we need to start it from the grassroots up. I think that that's how most social changes have happened throughout history. So keep pushing is the bottom line, and eventually this is going to take. But it's going to take time and it's going to take sacrifice.
And I think to add to that, certainly grassroots, and we definitely need the policy shifts, because right now our whole system of incentives and subsidies is flipped on its head of where it should be. Like, I personally believe that you should have to get certified to poison the planet, not to be organic, right? And, there are countries like Costa Rica where the government actually pays farmers for the ecosystem services that we provide. So if you can show using proven metrics that you've increased pollinator habitat, water recharge areas, that you're sequestering carbon, you get a payment because you are part of the public trust. And I think we need to look at that here in the United States.
Thank you. So another thing that really came out to me is around the whole issue around science and who controls science and who benefits from science. And it's clear throughout our society in the past 3 or 4 years that there's really been an assault on science, that there's been more move towards kind of almost values-based thinking and kind of almost a Pollyanna approach, that science is not in the public interest, or that science has an ideological grounding. I'd love to hear how you folks think about that assault, how to counteract it, and also assault on science, or how does maybe a better way to frame it is, how does good science fit into a food sovereignty approach or into a food justice approach?
Yeah, so this is, science itself isn't the problem, it's how it's conducted and how it's being used. Science is a tool. Science it allows us to understand things on a much broader scale. It allows us to make predictions as far as what's going to look good or what's going to work and what's not going to work. How it's being used right now and manipulated becomes problematic, and I think that is where the mistrust of science is really coming from. Is the fact that it's you can use scientists are not devoid of belief systems. They're not devoid of opinions, but if they address their opinions and assess their belief systems using the scientific framework, it can really help us to obtain what's real and what's not. Right now, it's being used to corrupt those belief systems and push forward this mentality that you had put forward, or that you had mentioned earlier concerning greed, and that's not right.
So I've been a high school biology and chemistry teacher for 17 years. And in 2017, I gave my students the same old homework assignment I usually have. It's got a bunch of links to the EPA climate change website, some critical thinking questions. And they came back and they said, Ms. Penniman, we couldn't do our homework. What do you mean? The website shut down, right? Very, very real lesson in what it means to have government censorship of basic critical science. And I don't know what the remedy is. I mean, we're living in bold and crazy times, but I think that part of the solution is citizen science, which is a fancy way of saying that we're all scientists and we all have the capacity to collect reliable data, aggregate that data, make predictions, and come up with useful conclusions. And I think getting all of us and our young folks involved in that, whether it's, your bud burst or your earthworm count per shovel or whatever it is, I think democratizing science helps to build that community support and makes people a lot more skeptical when the powers that be tell you that science is BS, because obviously it's crucial.
It's crucial.
So, I guess I'm dating myself, but I mean, I remember a time when science was not always a friend of the organic movement, and I imagine it probably still isn't in some ways, in which corporate-backed studies or university-backed studies were set out to disprove regenerative or organic agriculture. That, if we're going to feed the world, we need conventional ag is obviously kind of one riff off of that. So what I want to know is, who controls what is considered good science? How is science defined? And what does that mean for historically marginalized and indigenous communities? And what can be done to reframe science? As you said, you mentioned it as kind of people-based science or citizen-based science. But how do we reframe science, the ownership of, for example, genetic material, so that it's not extracted from indigenous tribes just because somebody came in and did a scientific process on it? Or tech.
I'll let you go first.
It's a challenging question. I think that something that is personally heartbreaking to me is when knowledge that we've held deeply in indigenous communities, for example, that trees are part of a superorganism that talk to each other through mycelial networks and share sugars and minerals and support and messages. That is known deeply. Like it's in the Yoruba Oduifa, thousands of year-old oral scriptures held in West Africa, that knowledge. But then, 15 years ago, some science is done with radioactive carbon and a TED Talk, and now we really know it, right? And I don't know how to rectify it, but fundamentally we have to expand our understanding of what is legitimate ways of knowing if we're going to survive as a species.
I think, in a lot of cases, and even within the organic realm, you had said that science was used to kind of stifle organic development and things. A lot of times it isn't an insidious thing, it's that the scientists just don't get it, right? And they don't understand the systems that they're trying to study. And so they're not initially setting out to cause problems or anything like that, but as a result, because they haven't walked a mile in your shoes, like I had said earlier, it leads to this. And that also comes down to your example of, there are many things that we can learn from just if the scientists would just listen and start to try to pursue some of these things that are either part of native cultures or other interpretations of the land, and apply the scientific framework to that to try to draw that out. Because what ends up happening is that a lot of times you go down a road with science and we get kind of locked into a certain path, right? Where we just keep on digging ourselves deeper and deeper and deeper into it until you just can't get back out. And so some things that are dismissed as ridiculous end up becoming pretty relevant, but it takes somebody that's willing to actually listen to those things. And scientists aren't necessarily always good at that. They're great at proclaiming their own expertise too often.
So I think, what this all comes down to for me, or a lot of it, what it comes down to, is a really fascinating interplay between historical traditions, which are often ignored, as you brought out, Leah, the role of science and how that all plays into kind of equity and it really comes to me down to kind of who owns, what is the narrative that we all embody, that we all have in our heads, and who owns that narrative, and how do we change that narrative so that it is one that's supportive of new paradigms, new ecological frameworks that combine ecology and equity. So I'd like to leave you guys. I have to do some mundane housekeeping announcements, but if you have any last words for us, I'd love to give you that opportunity.
Last words. Well, yeah, you know.
Parting shots.
Right. You know, yes, be a part of the change that we need right now. We desperately need that change on our culturally, you know, within farming, within so many different levels here. We really have to, it's going to take people sticking their necks out in order to change this huge ship's trajectory. And there's only one way that happens, and that's by people doing it. So be bold.
So I have a closing word, but I was also told I have to give 2 announcements or I'm going to get in trouble. So one of them is, y'all are welcome to get this book at the 10, and I'll be signing it tomorrow night. All the proceeds go to the Black Farmer Fund of New York. And also, if for folks who identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color, Latina, Asian, we're going to have breakfast at 7:30 on the right-hand side. Talk about some things, so y'all should come. And I think to your point about narrative, maize to me is a perfect example of who controls the narrative. Like right now, the way our society looks at maize, right, is it's a monocrop. You turn it into biofuels or corn syrup, which you pump into the vein of our children to drive the diabetes crisis. You genetically modify it with BT and or Terminator. You laden it with chemicals to destroy the fish in the Gulf of Mexico, et cetera, and you rip it away from its siblings, beans and squash. Or is corn a gift from Sky Woman? Is it the mother of life? Is it one of 3 sisters who live in synergy of nitrogen fixing and shading and support? Is it something that in turn needs to be freely given, right? And I think in maize, which is a indigenous crop to this continent, when we have restored maize to her rightful place with her sisters and her rightful place as a gift from a deity, then we'll know, right, that we've arrived. So.
Thank you.